On a June day in 1987, somebody I'd been dating once called, and he was then dating some guy named Cleve Jones who had a crazy idea for a quilt. And we had a nice civilized dinner at which he sold me on the concept. I thought it was brilliant. He'd had a lot of other people telling him he was crazy, so he was glad to have somebody think it was an okay idea. But I didn't come from a background of activism. I had just finished my MBA at Stanford and had been looking forward to a career in international marketing. But a very dear friend in business school got sick, and I spent time being his caretaker until he died, and it rearranged my priorities. It made me think. And I think other people felt like we're going to put our lives on hold in that summer of '87. We're going to drag our dead to Washington and lay them out on America's front lawn. They may be colorful, but they're still our dead, and demand that attention be paid. And then we were going to go back to life, and it just didn't work that way. There was such a sense of ownership and responsibility for the quilt, and so many people wanted the quilt to come to their city. And we just said, okay, this is going to be our work for a few years. And after a few years, I'm like, this is going to be my life's work. Well, that first volunteer meeting was on June 10th, 1987, just about 35 years ago exactly. And we only had about 6 people come to it. Gert McMillan was one of them. But the remarkable thing happened almost the next day. We put up signs on this little storefront we had rented saying what we needed. We needed paper, scissors, glue, fabric, sewing machines. And literally that was a Friday night. And we came in on Saturday morning and there must have been 40 people in line down Market Street carrying boxes of stuff. And we're like, okay, people want this. It's the right time. There was already momentum in the community because other activists around the country had called for a march on Washington for gay and lesbian rights that October. And, but they didn't have an AIDS component to it. And Cleve and others really felt like there has to be some portion of this that acknowledges AIDS and that acknowledges our losses. And I think one of the reasons we were able to recruit so many people and it built the way it did was so many other people felt the same way, that they would have gone to the march with their best friend and their best friend had died. And they wanted a way to have that person be there with them. But for the average person without medical skills, I just felt like, for me, I had to do something. I didn't necessarily know how to sew. Gert taught me how to sew. But I just felt like I have got to take this energy and channel it somewhere. And it turns out that a lot of people were going through the same thing. And, you know, together we bumbled and stumbled our way through to get that first display out there. The size of each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, which is traditionally the size of a grave. And from the very beginning, that was the only size we ever considered. We wanted to show how much space this person would take up if a dead body were laid out on our nation's capital. Panels are as unique as people. There's no common material people use. Spray paint, cut out letters, stitched down. In the old days, it was photos that were encased in plastic and then tucked down. And since then, there's technologies developed where you can put the photo right onto the fabric, and there's a lot of that. But we always said, tell the story of the person. Tell us what was meaningful to that person. And I don't know why an air conditioning vent would have been meaningful to somebody, but we have a quilt section with an air conditioning vent on it. We have quilt sections that we have to plug in because they have racer lights that go around the edges. We have several quilt sections where we have to put new batteries in at displays. There's one that has a little close and play, and when you open it up, it's Diana Ross, I Hear a Symphony. Just amazing what people think of. At the very beginning, we were trying to figure out how people were going to be able to get up close to see panels. If we really did this as a crazy quilt and sewn them all in next to each other, all anybody would be able to see is the ones around the perimeter, and they wouldn't be able to walk out onto it. So we thought, okay, we need some way to make a block, some way to make a section where we can it'll look like a quilt, but it'll be fabric walkway so people can get out to see it. Panels are 3 feet by 6 feet. If you take 8 of them, you can form a 12-foot by 12-foot block. And each panel now is sewn into one of those blocks permanently. You're next to so-and-so for the rest of your death. And there you are. And that block gets numbered. And when we do the displays, 4 of those get put together in such a way that there's always a way you can stand and read at least one of them. And we are now just passing the 6,000 block mark, which means over 48,000 panels. But that doesn't mean that that's the total number of people memorialized. Many panels were made for partners, so there's lots of doubles. And then many times organizations or groups came together to commemorate everyone in their group. And those panels could have anywhere from 5 to a couple hundred names. So right now, when we read the names of the dead at a full display, it's a little over 100,000 people being memorialized. From the very beginning, what we wanted to do was show individual lives that were lost. And the more we planned that first event with the quilt going out at dawn on October 11th, the more we thought, we don't want this to be a bunch of speeches, and we don't want anything other than people to know who these people were. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought, okay, no speeches, no opening. We'll just start by reading the names of our dead. And as we do that, sections of quilt will unfold, and at some point it will all be open and the public will be allowed on it. And then we thought, okay, but then once it's open, why stop? We can read the names all day. And so we lined up 40 or 50 people who were going to read names the whole morning of the whole thing. And then we had an open mic where people could come up and read a list that we gave them, but then also add their own names. And people would often end by saying, and my son, Johnny John Boy Politano, or, and you know, my first grade teacher, Miss Evelyn. Those little personal things at the end were what jolted people to say, oh, this isn't just a list, this list means something to that reader. And again, it built that kind of connection. That first summer of '87, I would say the first 1,000 panels came from gay community hubs around the country. As that display got closer, though, we had sent out a mailing at the beginning of the summer to grief counselors across the country. And back then, it was a mailer. There was no internet. It was a little, and we licked all the stamps and all that, thousands of pieces of licking stamps. And we mailed it all out, and we didn't think twice about it. But as the deadline for panels for that display got closer, we had, over 3 days, almost 1,000 pieces of overnight mail from mothers all across the country. Mothers who couldn't tell their church groups what their sons had died of. Fathers who were brushing off questions at work about what happened to your son. And these women, for the most part, would make these beautiful panels that were not the protest banners we were making. And they were so desperate and so lonely for connection that they mailed them off to a bunch of gay men in San Francisco who they didn't even know. Reporters started coming in late June, around Pride. We'd only been at this for a couple of weeks. The March on Washington was at that point less than 100 days away, and we started adding numbers and sort of getting ahead of it. Reporters were way ahead of quilts. And I guess it got to be about Labor Day, with about a month to go, and we were like, oh, you know, we're wildly inflating, and the mall is a huge place, and there are going to be 1 million people at this march, and we're going to have this thing that looks like a postage stamp, and we're going to fail. And there was a rough week or two there of, okay, we didn't do it. We don't have the momentum. And then we had 800 pieces, 900 pieces of overnight mail from all those mothers across the country. And it didn't just change how we felt to have these allies everywhere. There was a sense of relief of, okay, this is going to succeed. This is large enough that it's going to make a statement. And so by the time we got to Washington, we had almost 2,000 panels. It took up the entire city block in front of the Hirshhorn Museum, right smack in the middle of the mall, which meant everybody literally walked through the quilt on those walkways to get to the stage for the rally. And all the way along, all these groups from all over the country got their megaphones going, and they're yelling for their rights, and it was terrific and impactful. And then everybody went through this quiet moment where you got to the quilt and dead silence, and everybody went through the whole thing in silence. And as they came out the other end, they would pick it up again down there. But we didn't have any big signs that said, shh, quiet. The reverence of it was so obvious. But it was remarkable to watch almost 1 million people pull down into this place and come back out. And it did exactly what we wanted. It made AIDS a part of that march. We came off that display to requests from hundreds of people around the country, assuming that the quilt was going to come to their city soon. And what could they do to help? And there was an assumption that there was going to be a national tour. And so a small band of us on staff took these people up at their word and said, okay, if you want the quilt to come to your city, you need to prove to us that you can handle it. And we'll bring the quilt, but you have to do everything else. And by the end of that winter, we had 20 cities around the country that were willing to do this and had formed committees and were ready to go. And on April 4th, 1988, we loaded the quilt in a truck. We had a truck in Winnebago. And this group of 6 people traveled around the country and lived in the Winnebago and carried quilt in a truck that we named Stella. 3 men and 3 women. All the men have died. All the women are still with us. We did the top 20 cities in the U.S., starting in LA and going down through the South and around through the North and ending up in Washington and Oregon and back to San Francisco over the course of the summer of '88. And by the time the tour was done, our 2,000 panels was 8,000. By the end of 1989, with such a strong chapter network in place, we felt like we didn't have to go on tour so much as if a chapter said they wanted to do a display, we knew they had the ability and we didn't have to travel around with it. And so we started doing literally hundreds of displays a year where we would send out quilt in a box. And we did those sorts of smaller displays all throughout 89, 90, 91, 92. And all these displays that we do outdoors in DC are always in October. And one of the reasons that they happen when they did is because we're usually in the throes of a presidential election. And us being able to get coverage around HIV and AIDS can often prompt candidates to have to make a remark or say something on an issue that they, even right up through that with the beginning of the Clinton administration, felt like they had to dodge because it was divisive. We knew that '96 was a presidential election again, and the decision was made in the summer of '95 to do the display of the entire quilt on the Mall in Washington, and we announced it then. And human beings love deadlines. And almost immediately, we started getting panels from people saying, I've been postponing this for years. You're going to do this big display. I want my uncle in it. I want my lover in it. And we were swamped again with quilt panels. So that display on the National Mall in '96, October of '96, started at the steps of the Capitol and went all the way down past all the Smithsonian museums up to the base of the Washington Monument, and up not just the flat green part you see, but even up into the trees. I think it was about 42,000 panels. From '96 to about 2000, the quilt was based here in San Francisco. There was a move right around then. It was the height of the dot-com craze here. Warehouse space was ridiculously expensive. And luckily, several people on the board from Atlanta said, you know, the epidemic is moving to the South. We are not well represented among people of color on this quilt. We will take it on. We will find a warehouse space in the South. We'll build relationships with the Martin Luther King Center, with the Southern Poverty Law Center. We'll find ways to keep this quilt relevant in a community that needs it, in the same way that the gay community needed it at the beginning. Early in 2019, the quilt organizers at that point in Atlanta reached out to John Lewis, and John Lewis reached out to Nancy Pelosi because they were looking for a merger partner. They had run out of resources, and the quilt was getting very big, and it needed more support than they could find. And Nancy reached out to Gilead and said, I'd like to do something to save the quilt. I would like to be able to move it back to my hometown, and Atlanta would like to gift it to them, but we need resources to make all that happen. And while we're at it, let's save the archives too by giving them to the Library of Congress. And so it was very much a brainchild of John Lewis and Nancy Pelosi, calling John to say, what do you think? And John Cunningham, who ran the National AIDS Memorial Grove and is now CEO of the National AIDS Memorial, was ecstatic. There was always a sense that this is a synergy. These are our two largest national AIDS memorials, and they fit together well. And so there was this exciting time at the end of 2019 where the stars aligned, and the folks in Atlanta got the resources they needed to be able to fold up their operation and know that the quilt was going to be well taken care of. We had always asked people, when they make a panel, send us a card or a letter, tell the story of the person, send us anything, any materials you want archived. And people would send that, but they would also send half-written symphonies or finished dissertations. And we ended up with 44-drawer lateral file cabinets filled in panel number order, filled with all of the materials about these people's lives. And we never had the resources to do anything with it. And part of the magic of this move back to San Francisco was we were dealing with two very powerful members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi here and John Lewis there. And Nancy reached out to the Library of Congress. And at some point, I had a call and Cleve had a call from the Librarian of Congress who said, would you entrust your archives to us for the American people? And after all those years of fighting the Reagan administration to even get noticed, to have somebody say, this is valuable, these lives are valuable, your own government wants to preserve them. Amazing.